All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. If you are just joining us, feel free to put your name and the government that you work for in the chat so we can get a sense of who we have in the room. But good afternoon. My name is Isabel Garcia. I am calling in from Chicago, Illinois, and I am a project leader here at the Government Performance Lab, where I am very involved in the day-to-day management of the Procurement Excellence Network, otherwise known as PEN. And we are super excited to have you join us today for today's training on unbundling large contracts to advance vendor diversity. As I see people coming in, I'm seeing a lot of new names and new faces, which is really exciting. So for those of us who are here joining us for the first time, welcome. PEN, the Procurement Excellence Network, is a free online community for state and local, for state and local procurement professionals who want to transform their procurement in their governments to be more efficient and fair, results-driven, equitable, and strategic, which we at the GPL believe are the key pillars of procurement excellence. We have a number of different free offerings as a function of PEN. We have interactive trainings like this one. For those of you who work directly in small and local government, we have a member-only part of our website, which has a member directory and an online discussion board, so you can connect and problem solve with other procurement professionals. And we have access to one-on-one office hours with a GPL staff. So if you're here for the first time, we really hope you will join our growing community. As of yesterday, we are 800 state and local procurement professionals, which is super exciting. And Amanda will drop a link to the sign up page in the chat, but we will come back to PEN at the end of today's presentation. So as you can probably see with the Zoom backgrounds, I'm joined today by several of my colleagues here at the GPL. We have Amanda Jaffe, Elena Hofnagel, Hope Patterson, and Laura Merrifield, who you will hear from throughout today's call and who will help facilitate our breakout room discussions towards the end. So now that you have a little bit of a sense of who we are and what PEN is, we want to know more about you. So to kick us off, we're just going to take a minute or two to do this quick icebreaker Zoom poll to get a better sense of the procurement equity work and priorities in your own government. So take a minute to fill out the following Zoom poll, which Amanda just launched, and we will leave it open for a minute so we can see who we have in the room with us today. All right, I'm seeing super interesting results come in. Amanda, you can go ahead and end that poll and share with folks so they can see what I'm seeing. But it looks like a number of you actually have unbundled contracts multiple times, about 38%, which is super exciting. We will have a lot to learn from you during today's training. And then a number of you also, maybe unsure if your government has unbundled contracts, but the thing I find most interesting is the answer to the second question, which says that the overwhelming majority of your governments, city staff are really the people leading the push for equity, which is all of you. So really important to keep that in mind as we go through today's training and think about the different ways that you can push equity in your own governments. Thank you. Great. So here is a brief agenda for today. This training provides the opportunity to openly discuss challenges, share experiences and insights with peers regarding unbundling. So that 38% of you who have done this before, we will be looking at you. We've broken up today's training into 3 different parts. We're going to start off by framing this important issue within a larger context, and then we're going to share an overview of some different strategies for unbundling, including criteria to consider in making this decision and best practices. We'll then go over to a super exciting case study from the city of Phoenix, unbundling its landscaping contracts, for which we are very thrilled to have TJ Martin, the Chief Assistant City Attorney in the city of Phoenix, joining us today. TJ led this initiative and will share some key learnings from this experience. And then we are going to wrap up today's session with some small breakout discussion groups where you can start talking about how to get started with unbundling in your government, or talk about future contracts you might want to unbundle if time allows. And just so you know, as always, we are going to share all of the different training materials via email after today's session ends, and you can also always find them on our event page. So the last thing I'll say, one of our goals for today is we really want to create a space for learning, sharing, and dialogue. So please feel free to come off mute at any point and share questions with us, or you can share them in the chat. I already see a notification that says 53, so the chat is really blowing up. And also, if you're able, we encourage you to turn on your camera for the next hour to facilitate a more engaging training discussion. Okay, so let's get started. I wanted to start today by addressing a number of barriers that small and diverse businesses face when bidding on government contracts. However, I do want to make a distinction between small and diverse businesses because they're not interchangeable. So a lot of the barriers that I'm going to walk through on the left in just a moment are challenges that small businesses face, particularly those who are new to government contracting. And what we'll mostly be talking about throughout today's training are challenges that small businesses face of not being able to handle, for example, the size and the scope of large government contracts. These are challenges that are associated with being a small firm, especially ones new to government, as I just said, but they are not necessarily associated with being a minority-owned or a woman-owned firm. That said, helping small businesses win government contracts is a really great strategy for advancing vendor diversity, because a disproportionate number of small business owners are also minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, or historically disadvantaged in some ways. This is the result of historic underinvestment, which results in outcomes like a lack of capital, a lack of networking opportunities, or lack of other pathways to economic advancement. So awarding more government contracts to small businesses is actually a really powerful economic development strategy that invests in historically disinvested communities by creating more jobs locally, by hiring staff, which leads to business growth, and by putting government dollars back into our local community. So here at the Government Performance Lab, we've done a number of different vendor surveys with governments, and the common challenges that you see on this slide that we found out here are 6 of the most common things we consistently hear from vendors who want to do work with businesses. First, we hear that many vendors find navigating government websites can be extremely confusing of where to even find a contracting opportunity. Second, once they find opportunities, we have heard stories of vendors wading through long RFPs that are tens or even hundreds of pages long, that have, unclear submission instructions and require vendors to submit numerous complicated documentation or to go through notarization. Third, many small businesses don't bid even because of the insurance and the bonding requirements that require significant financial capital that they just don't have. Fourth, here on this list, many RFPs are actually advertised to businesses who are already registered in government vendor portals. And there's a lack of targeted outreach to small and minority business owners who have never worked with governments before. So they don't even know what opportunities exist to do business with government. Fifth, let's think about a business, even once they have won a contract, many governments don't pay their vendors on time. And smaller businesses don't have the capital to wait for payment. So if they're not getting paid, in some cases, they might decide, A, to never work with government again, or they might even be forced to shut down. And we can think about this in contrast, larger firms are more likely to be able to absorb these payment delays. And then sixth, and last on the someone muted me. Oftentimes vendors don't bid because the opportunity is written or it's scoped in a way that prevents small firms from bidding on it. So for example, the scope of work is just too large to take on, or with requirements that are too hard to meet. And the impact of all of this is that small and diverse firms have a much harder time bidding on and winning government contracts. So as a result, these firms are receiving a smaller share of contracted dollars than you would expect based on the number of firms that are ready, willing, and able to take on specific projects. One Urban Institute study quantified this discrepancy at minority-owned businesses getting only 57 cents of each dollar you would expect them to get if they were receiving contracts based on availability. So what that means is there's a huge discrepancy between the firms that exist and could do the work and what percentage are actually awarded contracts due to all of these different challenges that we just went through. Larger and incumbent firms are getting a much larger share of local dollars. This is because, for a lot of reasons, but if they have won a contract before, they're more familiar with government processes, and oftentimes these businesses will have actually dedicated staff to respond to RFPs or requests for proposals. So at the GPL, we've done a lot of work both scoping out some of these different barriers that small and diverse firms face, and also developing tools and strategies to address these barriers. Today, in the next 50 minutes, we're going to focus on unbundling as a strategy to address number 6, which is the size and the scope of solicitations just being too large. But if you're interested in strategies to address challenges 1 through 5 and others, definitely check out our publication, which is Using Government Procurement to Advance Racial Equity, which outlines dozens of other strategies to use procurement and contracting as a lever to advance vendor diversity and racial equity in your governments. And Amanda will drop a link to this in the chat. So one quote that I wanted to elevate from one of our vendor surveys said, I don't believe that small businesses have much of a chance to bid on most opportunities. Let's look at 2 examples together of what we mean by the size and the scope being too large and why small businesses might feel like they don't even stand a chance. So here is scenario 1. We have de-identified these to be Citylandia and Countyville, but these are very real scenarios that we've seen in governments that we have worked with. But scenario 1 says, transform the streets of Citylandia. It reads, are you ready to be part of history? Citylandia, a thriving metropolis known for its vibrancy, is seeking a skilled contractor to lead a repavement project spanning across its 4 distinctive downtown quadrants. Now, if you're a small business, you might be feeling totally overwhelmed by the sheer size and scope of this project. It would be much more manageable if this opportunity, let's say, was divided into geographic zones, so vendors could apply to repave, just one of the 4 downtown quadrants. And this would be a project that is much more feasible in size. Scenario 2, connect with every home in Countyville. We see it reads, with the County Council's commitment to transparent communication, Countyville seeks a vendor to spearhead a door notification project. This initiative involves graphic design, printing, and widespread distribution of mailers to every doorstep across the county's diverse neighborhoods. Now, again, if you're a small business and you see this, you might be thinking there is a lot of complexity in this one project. So it could be really helpful if the areas of expertise, such as, graphic design, mailing, and printing, were actually separate components that the vendor could bid on. So let's say you have a particular expertise in graphic design, but not in printing resources, you still have a chance to win part of Countyville's contract. So hopefully these 2 examples illustrate why small and diverse firms either bid and can't compete, or they just choose not to bid because they don't have the capacity to take on such large and complex projects. Which brings us to the opportunity, unbundling your large contracts to advance vendor diversity. And when I say unbundling, I mean breaking up a large contract into smaller pieces, such as dividing a large service area into regions or even just into individual sites, like we just saw in that Citylandia repavement scenario. And a question I want to keep coming back to is, why should only one business, especially in many cases, one that isn't even located in the government's jurisdiction, reap all of the rewards of taxpayer dollars from a public contract when multiple businesses are just as capable of performing. So some key benefits highlighted on this slide to unbundling are, it encourages more firms to compete on contracts previously out of reach. It keeps tax dollars from a public contract in the local economy, and it invests in historically disadvantaged businesses, as we just talked about. It is also a strategic economic development strategy that creates opportunity for businesses to explore working with the government, and then they can scale up their business if they want to grow from there. But it gives them, like a first time working with government. It reduces risk by spreading responsibilities across multiple vendors. So you can think about, a government avoiding having all of their eggs in one basket. And then last, it can enhance competition and innovation by increasing the number of bids. But despite all of these many, many benefits, there are valid reasons why governments might be resistant to unbundling contracts. It takes effort and it takes buy-in. On this slide here are two of the main concerns we have heard. We have heard, first, administrative complexity and what comes with managing multiple contracts. And then the second is a concern around increased costs and prices going up if the government is unable to take advantage of economies of scale. So I'd love to pause now for just a few minutes and open it up to a discussion around some of these barriers. Feel free to either just come off mute or to write in the chat. Would love to know if these barriers or concerns resonate with you and other thoughts coming to mind. And then also, especially for those of you who have unbundled before, how have you addressed these challenges? For those new to unbundling, how might you think about addressing these challenges? So I will pause for a few minutes now to open it up for discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Greg Spearman, City of Tampa. We have really been very, very successful in Tampa in unbundling these large contracts. Mainly in the area of janitorial services and also in the area of landscape management, types of services. And this initiative is really a joint partnership between the City of Tampa Purchasing Department and our Equal Business Opportunity Office. So we look at these large contracts and we work with the end user department to see what the opportunities are, particularly in the area of janitorial services. One of the ways that you can do that is to break up the contracts by location. You can group locations, let's say in one or two buildings versus having a massive contract that covers multiple buildings. Now, administratively, that does add to more oversight. It does add to additional costs, but you are creating opportunity. And that's what we want to make sure that we are doing, creating opportunity for some of these, smaller firms to be able to participate. And yes, you're going to see, costs go up sometimes, but this is a decision that the City of Tampa has made in terms of, awarding contracts to small minority-owned firms, because we do want to, increase opportunities, for employment. We do want to make sure that as citizens in our local economy who are business owners, they have an opportunity to participate in that. They live in the area, they pay taxes in the area. So it's the administration's belief that we should create those opportunities and reduce whatever barriers we might have. We have looked at things like bonding, for an example, and by breaking smaller contracts, larger contracts into smaller contracts, we've been able to not necessarily require the bonding aspect, in terms of, part of the requirements. But yes, we have seen the administrative complexity involved. We have seen increased costs involved, but we've also seen a lot more activity in terms of opportunities for small minority-owned firms to bid. And one other final comment before someone else wishes to speak. We have in Tampa what's known as a sheltered market program that's backed by a disparity study that was done several years ago. So when we do unbundle these contracts, and there's a cap of $300,000, we only allow the small firms that are certified by the city of Tampa to compete against their peer group. So that particular additional layer, increases the opportunity that someone in that peer group, or maybe multiple firms in that peer group, who happen to be a certified City of Tampa minority-owned firm, is going to get the contract and win the business, provided they meet all the requirements. So because of the disparity study we did years ago, we are able to set goals, some instances, but we're also able to shelter projects so that only those small firms within their peer group can bid against themselves and therefore be able, to be awarded the contract.
That's great, Greg. Thank you so much for sharing. And it's really great to hear. I love what you said about the opportunity, right? It's not about unbundling every single contract. We're saying to do it when there's a really great opportunity to get small and diverse firms involved in work with the city. So that's great to hear. I see two other hands up. Alicia, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name right.
You pronounced it correct. Are you able to hear me?
I am. Go ahead.
All right, excellent. So Alicia Balui, I'm the Chief Procurement Officer at the New York City Department of Education. And we've been utilizing the unbundling method for some time prior to my start. But more recently, I've been looking at it particularly more closely because in some instances, we structure the solicitation where we have requirements where we separate the bid by aggregate classes or geographic location, and the award would still go to one vendor, right? So some of the things that I've incorporated is the use of caps in the unbundling process to ensure that we limit the number of awards to particular vendors, because there are some instances where there are vendors that have the capacity to manage the entire portfolio. In addition to that, applying like backup vendors, so that, because, oftentimes awarding a vendor to a specific geographic region limits that vendor to service that region. So applying backups. Another thing that another policy change we've incorporated more recently at the DOE is we've allowed price and point preferences for city certified MWBEs. So, the goal of unbundling itself is to increase access and equity across a diverse group of vendors. But we also apply some allowances to allow for vendors to bid more competitive, small businesses and MWBEs to bid more competitively.
That's great. Thank you for sharing those concrete strategies that you guys have been employing in New York. We have time for one more comment from Jennifer.
Hi all, quick question. Jennifer Krupke, Port of Long Beach. I was curious, we're interested in developing a process to unbundle some of our construction contracts. Right now, we contract primarily with primes. And I was wondering if any of the folks are in this process or have unbundled large construction projects. And if so, could they put their email in the group chat so I could connect and find out how y'all went about doing that? Thank you.
Great. Love that. Facilitating community already. So if you have unbundled construction contracts, please put your email in the chat and Jennifer will connect with you. Seeing a couple of other barriers in the chat coming up around vendor capacity. I'm actually now going to hand it over to my colleague Amanda, who's going to hit on some of these different barriers that I see coming up, and we will have more time for this discussion later on in the presentation. So Amanda, over to you.
Thanks so much, Isabel. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you today. My name is Amanda, and I'm a Government Innovation Fellow based out of the city of Long Beach as well, where I work to support city governments across the country. And this past year, I was working closely with some cities on strategic procurement initiatives, actually including unbundling their janitorial services contracts. So similar to what Greg mentioned, this is a really common one and a really great place to unbundle. And I'll highlight those for you later in this presentation. But first, now that we've explored why unbundling large contracts can be a great tool to increase opportunities for small and diverse firms, we'll go over some strategies to unbundle and some criteria to consider for good opportunities to unbundle. So when getting started, an easy first step is to consider these 6 criteria to decide if the solicitation is a good candidate to unbundle. Because unbundling might not be the right approach for every contract you have within your jurisdiction, as we mentioned. So these are some specific indicators that could align with best fit contracts. The first is contract size. So consider if the solicitation is one of your largest contracts, either in scope or in dollars. This is an indication that it could be easily broken up into smaller pieces that still have significant responsibilities to increase opportunities for more small and diverse firms. Another is performance history. So consider if you have had issues with the performance of a contract in the past. If so, this might be a great sign that the current scope of work may be beyond the capacity of one vendor. And unbundling the contract may not only increase opportunities for new firms, but it also could improve performance as well. Another is contract history. So has this contract been awarded to the same vendor year after year? This might be an indicator that it's time to unbundle to re-solicit this, engage the market interest with a smaller scope for this solicitation. Another is contract interest. So if there has previously been a lot of interest and competition for this contract in the past, that's a great indicator that there is appetite out there in the market for more opportunities for these services to get involved. Another is available vendors. So if you are procuring for a common good or service for which a lot of potential vendors exist, so for example, as we've heard, janitorial services or landscaping services, this might be a good candidate to consider unbundling. And this also applies to services in which having a more specialized approach by vendor per location, or specifically a more diversified approach, would specifically improve the quality of the services. Like if you were to have each vendor take a unique approach based on the specific community they're serving, and that's something you actually want to see as part of the response to the RFP, for example. So I previously had actually supported a state in contracting for intake agent services for their childcare supports, and they decided to actually bid and then contract this individually by county instead of bidding this as a statewide contract, because they wanted each vendor to be able to provide services and then actually represent the community for which they were serving. And this was really important to them in not only being able to contract for the services, but also in evaluating the RFP responses. And that was the approach they took by actually unbundling this per county to be able to help that happen. And finally, another criteria to consider is if the contract could include subcontractors. And we will talk about this further on the next slide about best practices, but an alternative when separating scopes of work and thinking that this might not be the right fit to actually physically separate them can be to actually encourage subcontracting. And a lot of times subcontracting is always allowed within solicitations, but to actually explicitly call this out, explicitly make this easier for respondents, maybe by outlining which requirements you would like to see subcontracted, or even consider putting it as part of the evaluation criteria. And we'll go over more of that on the next slide as well. So if you have come to the point where you've decided that you have a contract that's a strong candidate to unbundle, there are some best practices to consider to set you up for success. The first is being really intentional about which method you are using to unbundle based on your specific scope of work. So this could be separating it by geographic location, as we've heard, so placing maybe all northern locations in one scope of work and all southern locations in another, or perhaps by responsibility. So coming back to Isabel's example earlier for this large mailing and printing and distribution contract, perhaps separating each of these services into different contracts that are distinct. Another important component is to ensure you are conducting vendor outreach. So your unbundling efforts will not be successful if the small and diverse firms that you are targeting do not know the opportunity even exists. So really take time to spread news about this unbundled opportunity widely and intentionally with your target audience. And additionally, it's important to build the vendor capacity of the small and diverse vendors you are hoping to increase opportunities for, so they are prepared to not only respond, but also to be able to submit strong proposals to your unbundled opportunities. So this might involve investing additional resources in providing technical assistance or boot camps to new vendors to be prepared for this upcoming opportunity. And you'll see some great examples of how Phoenix did that momentarily. And finally, it's also important to build internal buy-in so everyone who is impacted by this change, especially within your government, has an understanding of why it's important. You may experience some initial resistance or hesitation from staff around having perhaps a larger number of contracts to manage with this approach. So it's really important to create tools and structures to support all of your staff in taking on more contracts. And we have a lot of resources in our Procurement Excellence Network library online on tools for more actively managing these contracts that could support your staff. And as we mentioned on the previous slide, a contract might not be the right fit to unbundle into unique scopes of work. Some other tools, though, do exist that you could consider to still create new opportunities for small and diverse businesses through either subcontracting or a vendor bench contract approach. So subcontracting might be the right fit when you have a large project with a defined scope of work, but you want a single vendor to oversee all of that work. And that's perhaps why unbundling might not be the right fit. And so this might be perhaps the construction of a new building where there's definitely opportunity for one vendor to project manage, but then subcontracting for lots of the smaller pieces. And then a vendor bench approach might be the right fit when you have an anticipated need, but an undefined scope or timeline. So perhaps you already have built the building, but you want to prepare for standing repairs for this building, and you don't know exactly when they'll be needed or exactly which vendor you want to use at different times. So you can create this bench to get a lot of different new, small and minority diverse firms onto the bench who then can apply to opportunities as they arise, but they're already kind of pre-solicited, so they're able to go. So this year, the GPL supported the city of Charleston, South Carolina in unbundling a key janitorial services contract to increase opportunities for small and diverse firms. The city separated what was previously one large contract for these services for all city buildings into two separate RFPs, one for general city locations and another for locations with specific requirements like background checks. This made responding to either RFP easier for small and diverse firms, but especially this general location one, which provided a great opportunity for first-time respondents to begin working with the city since there was no additional special requirements needed. And this is exactly what the city saw happen. Both RFPs were awarded to the strongest respondents, which ended up being minority business enterprises. And the general location RFP was awarded to a new vendor who had not previously worked with the city before. So it's really great to see this approach being so successful for the city. And additionally, we wanted to share another example that we've supported this year of an unbundled RFP for janitorial services that hasn't been released yet, but had a really innovative approach to specifically group locations in the RFP by regions. And so this city decided to keep all of its services for those janitorial services in one RFP, but created these distinct groupings of all locations for respondents to decide which and how many they would like to propose services for, depending on the geographical location, the size and square footage of the facilities, and special requirements like background checks, health requirements were all specifically and very strategically grouped together. To offset a concern the city had that some small and diverse firms may struggle to provide services to locations throughout the entire city, and being able to perhaps provide the startup resources needed to obtain background checks for all employees, for example, they strategically grouped the locations based off these factors you can see in that table to the right. This was also a table that was actually included in the RFP or will be when it's released for all respondents to see and understand. The city also included local hiring as part of its evaluation criteria to further incentivize small and diverse firms from the community to respond and to be the ones actually obtaining these new, now smaller and unbundled opportunities. Next, we're going to move on to a case study from the city of Phoenix, Arizona. But I wanted to pause for a brief moment and see if anyone had any questions about any of the strategies and examples covered. And for sake of time, if anyone could just write them in the chat, I'll answer them directly from there. So feel free to add them there. But thank you so much for listening. And now I'm going to pass it over to Isabel and TJ.
Awesome. Great. Thank you, Amanda. So we are so lucky to have TJ Martin here with us today to talk about the city of Phoenix's successful unbundling of its landscaping contract that provided services across 400 locations. TJ serves as the Chief Assistant City Attorney for the City of Phoenix, where she also previously served as the city's Chief Procurement Officer until last November. In that role, TJ directed 30 procurement and administrative professionals responsible for sourcing goods and services and managing contracts averaging about $1 billion in annual spend. She is a licensed attorney in both Texas and Arizona with nearly 25 years of legal experience in both the public and private sectors. So welcome, TJ.
Thank you.
And just
Hi.
everyone, hi, some additional context to tee up this conversation. So prior to 2021, the city of Phoenix had been giving the vast majority of those sites, the 400 that I mentioned, to just 2 vendors, one of whom was earning 19 million of the 24 million dollar contract. And after unbundling, the city received twice as many responses and 2 contracts were awarded to small local businesses. So we're going to dive in with TJ now to hear how that happened. TJ, would love if you could just start out explaining and telling us a little bit about how you packaged the contract into the smaller parts that contractors could bid on.
Well, it all started as the city of Phoenix was participating in a Bloomberg cities program as a cohort where one of the activities, the options was to tackle or unbundle a contract. That was not our first option. However, simultaneously, as we were trying to figure out what we were going to do for the project, we had a vendor performance issue. Phoenicians are very serious about our desert landscaping. And so we were having calls to city council about palm fronds falling into places because they weren't timely being trimmed, and just a lot of issues. And the truth of the matter, the only satisfactory rating from any of our 34 departments that were using the landscape contract came from our fire department. Apparently our previous vendor loved the fire department. So our fire locations were having perfect services with other departments, not as much success. So one day driving home, I noticed that there were little small trucks advertising landscaping services, and kind of a light went off. And it was at that moment that we switched our project in the Bloomberg Cities Initiative to the unbundling, because I thought here was an opportunity for us to unbundle contracts and direct our efforts towards our local and small vendors. The problem was that one vendor could not keep up, but we were paying them. As you mentioned, they made 19 million out of 24 million in 4 years, and we were receiving subpar services. So it was opportune for us at that time to really kind of look at how we handled that. We also conducted a survey. We hosted a vendor symposium, invited all the landscapers to come in. We'll talk more about how we did that using news media. And so they came in. We said, how can we make this easier for you vendors? And we had over 100 local small vendors to attend. It was a virtual symposium, much like this one. And afterwards, we emailed a survey and allowed them to provide feedback. Was this helpful? What additional information would be helpful? What would make this easier for you to respond? And it was that survey that just gave us break down these locations, do more than provide us with an Excel spreadsheet of 400 locations, which caused us to then go in and create an interactive map. I think we have a slide or something that shows that later, but we created that map that showed the 400 locations across the city of Phoenix. And as you can see, I just selected one of those locations that identified the frequency of the services needed, the size of the services, and what was there? Was there grass? Were there palm trees that required, cutting and going in the air? And I think on the second page, as you can see in the top left corner, it says this is page 1 of 2. This is just a screenshot, so you can't see it here, but there's a contact person, whether or not this is a secure site or not, in which background check may be required. So it was all about recognizing much of what you've already talked about. 400 locations was too large for one vendor to provide us quality service. The complaints of the community, the fact that we could break this down regionally, which came from the recommendations in response to the survey.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'd love to hear a little bit more, since I know folks have been bringing up, how do we address these sources of resistance? How did you convince, in the city of Phoenix, how did you convince the staff that unbundling was the way to go, and, managing more contracts was going to be a strategic decision?
I always compare the city of Phoenix to an aircraft carrier. My sister is in the Navy. She's assigned to an aircraft carrier. So what I've learned is you can't turn the ship around overnight. And the city of Phoenix is a huge organization where when I arrived right before COVID, everything was, this is how we've always done it, which for me is like nails on a chalkboard, right? So it was not easy, but it was also not reasonable that we would pay $19 million to someone who was providing us insufficient services. And as a fiduciary for the city of Phoenix, in that role, responsible for fiscal responsibility and how we were using the funds of the city of Phoenix, our constituents weren't happy with that service. And that was an easy argument to make, because vendor performance said that citizens weren't happy, and we had spent tons of money with this vendor who was unable to do so. I was able to get support from higher ups. It was just the in-between who weren't happy. But once our city manager and our deputy city managers were on board, and it was like, we're going with TJ, then everybody else had to kind of fall in line. But I'm a self-proclaimed disruptor. As soon as someone tells me this is how we've always done it, I go full speed and trying to figure out how we do it another way, because it's about working smarter, harder, preserving already limited funds, and being sure I'm tight with my own money. So I except when it comes to shopping, but I also want to be reasonable with the funds for those for the citizens of the city of Phoenix. And so after making that argument, and always building a team, right? Building a team is exceptional. When we took on this project, I think it was Mr. Spearman who mentioned he partnered with EOD. We had our equal opportunity department to participate. We had our community and economic development department to participate. I went out and identified other external partners like Local First Arizona, who partners with the city of Phoenix doing community outreach with vendors. And then, because this was a landscaping contract, I Googled what landscape organizations are out there and found the Arizona local Landscape Contractors Association. And I brought those people in, and we formed a team, and it made it a lot easier when I had both internal and external partners to work with in communicating this. And then I invited our communication staff to participate, and that kind of helped push this further along.
That's great. It really takes a village. So I would love if you could talk to us a little bit more about some of the outreach strategies to these small and local businesses. You touched on that a little bit. And then also, once you reached them, what were some of the vendor capacity strategies to build them up and get them ready to bid on this contract?
This is actually my favorite part of the whole project. As I mentioned, we had a partnership with both internal and external stakeholders. And from there, we started brainstorming our communications department had done a campaign throughout the city about how we can engage them. We have a news page on our public facing website. We're connected on LinkedIn and Twitter and all the social media forums. And so I just heard that presentation and said, oh my, how can I use them to get this out? And so I reached out to the young man who was assigned to finance. We did a press release that goes on our public facing website. And once that went out, the local media was so interested because, of course, partnering with someone whose responsibility is to get headlines or to, it was like, I think the theme of the media was, how can you get a piece of the $25 million pie or something like that? And it was very successful. It was like, it was genius. And so in response to that one article that we wrote and posted on our website about getting your piece of a $25 million pie for landscapers, they were coming out of the woodwork. I mean, we had people calling. I had a lady to call and say, my husband can learn how to cut grass. What does he need to know how to do? I mean, it really conjured up a lot of interest. And so in addition to doing that media, so we got free media attention. Fox News, NPR, Telemundo, several radio stations called us, and we participated in several interviews. And that's the very unattractive picture that I think you showed on your first slide, where my mouth is open. But I'm communicating and talking to them about exactly what we were trying to do to encourage local vendors here to participate. And so we advertised that we were having an information session. They came into the information session. We had well over 100 people to register and actually attend. And I don't know if you guys have tried anything, but getting that number of people to actually attend and participate is phenomenal. And then over 50% of those people participating in that virtual session where we talked about what we were going to do and where we introduced those local partners like Local First Arizona and the Contractors Association. We sent that survey out and we had over 50% input from that survey, which we used to then help us frame our solicitation. But Local First, part of the Bloomberg cohort program that we participate, there was a $15,000 grant. And so we allowed that to be awarded to Local First so that they could provide light touch technical assistance directly to respondents to the solicitation, those small businesses who never responded to a solicitation. So they could, because my staff and I could not provide hands-on guidance on responding. So we made a gift of that grant to Local First so that they could then fund office hours, assistance, and access to computers or whatever that was going to be needed. Because as we know, local and small businesses, and you'll hear I use local and small businesses because, of course, in Arizona, we are prohibited from distinguishing between women and minority owned. So that's a local thing. But so they were able to use those funds for time and resources to provide that direct assist, host additional office hours. The city of Phoenix also hosted during the posting period of the solicitation, we held weekly video conferences so we could break down some of those complex terms in the solicitation. So we could talk about insurance requirements, so we can tell people what indemnification meant. There are terms that exist in our solicitations that someone in landscaping may or may not be familiar with. So for the 4 to 6 weeks that the solicitation was posted, we offered a weekly presentation to address those very complex issues.
That's fantastic, TJ. Thank you so much. I think it really helps add like a lot of tangible and concrete examples to what we've been talking about throughout this presentation. And I see a lot of nodding heads. Some folks are hopping to another meeting and we are at the hour. So just to close out really quickly, a poll is about to pop up on your screen. If you could give us some feedback on how you found today's event, it helps us be as responsive as possible to all of you as we plan for future events. Also, the poll is completely anonymous, so I will leave that up there for a minute to finish, and I'm going to, in 60 seconds, tell you about some other next steps. So as we mentioned, the GPL has a number of different publications on this topic of equity in contracting. On the slide here are 3 that I really want to draw your attention to. The first is a new publication on unbundling that goes over some of the strategies we spoke about today, but has additional case studies. The racial equity publication that I spoke about earlier today. And then last is a vendor survey publication if you're hoping to lead some vendor surveys in your community to learn more about barriers. Also, just want to say this great conversation that's happening in the chat. We have a community conversations board on our Penn website. It is for members only, which means it's for state and local procurement professionals. So if you are not yet a Penn member, please sign up to continue that conversation. Amanda will put a link to the sign up page. It is free. It's super easy to access, and look forward to continuing this rich discussion online. I also saw Elena put in the chat that we are always happy to do one-on-one GPL office hours to continue talking about some of these topics, or to brainstorm with you, or if you have a specific contract that you're hoping to unbundle and you could use some advice on, please bring it to us. Our email address is on this slide, but also Amanda will drop it in the chat. Those are also always free, and we are always happy to talk with you about specific cases in your governments. And then last, but certainly not least, if you like what you heard today, we do these events about once or twice every month. We have 2 exciting events coming up, one at the end of September, where we will hear from chief procurement officers on how they have successfully elevated the status of procurement in their jurisdictions. And then another one in October on raising the dollar purchasing threshold. So that is all from us today. Want to thank you all for your time and your engagement in today's event. And we hope to see you both online in the Penn community and at our next event. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good one.
Thanks, everyone.